Today, St Kilda is one of Melbourne's most iconic seaside suburbs, a vibrant blend of beach culture, bohemian charm, and colourful history. But long before Luna Park's grin lit up the foreshore, or espresso machines lined Ackland Street, this land was seen as little more than a swamp. In this documentary, we uncover the surprising, forgotten, and fascinating story of St Kilda, from early European encounters and quarantine ships to its rise as Melbourne's playground by the sea. The first Europeans to lay eyes on the land, we now call St Kilda, were likely members of the Charles Grimes expedition in 1802. On Thursday, the 20th of January, their schooner Cumberland anchored nearby. Grimes' journal described the area as largely swampy and marshy. After passing what is now Point Ormond and approaching the present-day Esplanade, he noted the soil as very bad and thinly wooded, and labelled the stretch along what we now call West Beach as low swampy country. In 1803, the Grimes survey party cruised along the shoreline again and dismissed the area as unsuitable for settlement. It would be several decades before Europeans began to occupy this marshy land. The first official European presence in St Kilda came with a grazing lease in 1839. A year later, in 1840, Victoria's first quarantine station was set up at Red Bluff in Elwood. That April, the bark Glen Huntly arrived in Hobson's Bay. A fever ship of 430 tons, Glen Huntly had lost 10 passengers to disease during the voyage. Alarmed by its arrival, Melbourne authorities quickly set up 2 quarantine camps at Red Bluff, one for the sick, the other for those who were still healthy. By June 1st, the healthy had been released. Those who died were buried by the seashore. In 1898, their remains were respectfully reinterred at St Kilda Cemetery. Glen Huntly Road, named after the bark, serves as a reminder of that grim episode. St Kilda was named in 1842 by Superintendent Charles La Trobe, inspired by a schooner called Lady of St Kilda that was moored offshore. The vessel's presence coincided with a picnic attended by La Trobe and local magistrate and businessman, Jonathan Binswer. During the event, La Trobe reportedly pointed to the ship and suggested naming the area after her. The schooner itself had an interesting background. Built in Dartmouth, England, she was originally owned by Sir Thomas Dyce Ackland, and was named to commemorate his wife, Lydia's 1810 visit to the remote Scottish island of St Kilda. The vessel was later sold, and in February 1841, sailed from Plymouth to Port Phillip, arriving on the 6th of July, 1841. A report in the Port Phillip Herald described her as a regular clipper, noting she had faced severe weather near the Cape of Good Hope and brought no passengers. At the time, Melbourne's population was just 4,479. The ship's brief anchorage near the present-day foreshore, apparently due to a drunken mutiny on board, left a lasting impression. Though some historians, like John Butler Cooper, have cast doubt on the naming tale's historical accuracy, it remains a charming part of local lore. The Lady of St Kilda was eventually wrecked in Tahiti in 1844. Long before European arrival, a bush track led from Melbourne to St Kilda was used by the Yalukit Willem clan of the Boon Wurrung people, part of the coastal tribes of the Kulin Nation. Early settlers, including Benjamin Baxter, later used this same track to move cattle, and it eventually evolved into St Kilda Road. The Yalukit Willem called the area around the Esplanade and St Kilda Beach Euro Roke, referring to the red-brown sandstone found along the shoreline. This stone was significant, used by Aboriginal people to sharpen axes, earning it the title of a Master Stone. But the impact of European settlement was devastating. By 1857, government official William Thomas recorded that the population of the Boon Wurrung and Woy Wurrung clans near Melbourne had fallen from 350 to just 28. The view of the Aborigines was that there is no point in having children without land and culture in which to bring them up. Shell mounds once visible along the St Kilda and Elwood foreshore are remnants of Aboriginal life, evidence of shellfish feasts that may have drawn people to the area as much as the tools they shaped. The lands that became St Kilda were opened for grazing in 1839, when authorities in Sydney granted a lease to Captain Benjamin Baxter. Born in Ireland, Baxter had served with British forces in Jamaica and India. He arrived in Sydney in 1836 aboard the convict transport Royal George, escorting prisoners. After settling in Melbourne in 1837, he became the city's first postmaster, before retiring in 1839 to focus on cattle farming. After Benjamin Baxter left the area, his leasehold was taken over by Thomas Enscoe and Company, owned by Thomas George and John Enscoe. Their hut, likely used by stockmen, stood at what is now Prince Albert Square, then known as Custom House Reserve. It was marked on a government plan as early as 1842, the first recorded building in St Kilda. An advertisement in the Port Phillip Herald on the 18th of November, 1842, announced the sale of allotments for a new village, initially to be called Fareham. Surveyor Thomas Nutt laid out the plan in early 1842, but the name St Kilda had already taken root, thanks to the beach's growing local use of that name. The name was officially approved on the 29th of August, 1842. At the 1842 land sales, Captain James Ross Lawrence, former master of the Lady of St Kilda, purchased a 2.5-acre block at the corner of the Esplanade and Fitzroy Street. He later named nearby Ackland Street in honour of Sir Thomas Dyce Ackland, a previous owner of the schooner. In the early 1840s, the only way for St Kilda residents to reach Melbourne was via a punt across the Yarra, though a rough bush track, once used by Aboriginal people, also existed. This path would later become St Kilda Road. In 1845, a simple bridge of redwood and hardwood was constructed, improving access. 2 years later, residents raised £25 to upgrade the route, matched by another £25 from the Melbourne Corporation. By the late 1840s, travellers, Mosman and Bannister, described St Kilda as a pleasant seaside retreat with elegant homes overlooking the bay, though not yet large enough to be called a township. Land agents were already promoting it as the Scarborough of the South, attracting prominent people to St Kilda. Yet not everyone was impressed. Others saw only rough huts, a quiet bay, bushland, and Aboriginal camps by the shore. The St Kilda Esplanade was originally known as the Terrace. As that name faded, residents debated between calling it the Promenade or the Esplanade. Both terms reflected its use as a leisure walkway, but eventually Esplanade won out, and Promenade slipped into obscurity. Interestingly, the Esplanade's sea-facing red sandstone cliffs were once quarried for road making. Contractors working for the Central Road Board stripped tons of stone from the beach and hillside, prompting strong protests from locals. As St Kilda grew into a village, residents objected to the degradation of their coastal landscape and lobbied to preserve it. In 1842, a street in St Kilda was named Fitzroy Street after Charles Fitzroy. But the same name had been given to another street in Prahran, causing confusion. To avoid this, Prahran reverted to the original name, Chapel Street, which remains today. St Kilda's development accelerated after the gold rush began. Howard's Royal Hotel, built in 1847, became a popular meeting place. By 1852, a baker named William Moody opened the first bakery on Fitzroy Street, marking the suburb's shift into a vibrant residential community. Early St Kilda settlers had their share of brushes with danger, even from bushrangers. Baker William Moody once narrowly escaped an encounter by ducking into the busy Bee Inn on Brighton Road. A more dramatic episode unfolded in October 1852, when 4 bushrangers on horseback chased a man to James Mooney's Royal Hotel. Sensing danger, Mooney locked the bar door, keeping patrons safely inside. As the bushrangers tried to smash it open with their gun butts, a quick-thinking customer, George Francis, cut the horses loose, forcing the attackers to flee in confusion. That same afternoon, the gang robbed more than 20 travellers along St Kilda Road, over a span of just 2.5 hours. Public outrage followed, and the government offered a reward of £2,000 for their capture. The scene was later immortalised in a painting by English-born artist William Strutt, titled Bushrangers on the St Kilda Road. It depicts the real 1852 robbery near present-day Elwood. At the time, St Kilda had no permanent police station, only a tent that served as a mobile outpost. Locals joked that the station's address was somewhere in the bush. Captured suspects were chained to logs until they could be transported to Melbourne. In the early days, the bay line from the Esplanade to Red Bluff was dotted with makeshift tents pitched by the so-called undesirable class, giving the area an air of desolation. But change came gradually. In June 1858, a police presence was formally established with the appointment of Sergeant Fenton and 9 constables to St Kilda. Transport links also began to take shape. In 1851, the first omnibus service between Melbourne and St Kilda was launched. The Premier Coach, operated by W. Wilson, owner of the Royal Hotel, departed daily from the Bull and Mouth Hotel in Burke Street. The fare was 1 shilling each way. Later, in 1869, the Melbourne Omnibus Company expanded services using 6 imported buses from New York. In April 1853, Antonio Gabrielli, a travelling financier with offices in Bombay and London, arrived in Melbourne aboard the steamer Harbinger. Backed by connections to Rothschild funds, Gabrielli offered an unprecedented £500,000 loan to the Melbourne City Council. Though limited by borrowing restrictions, the city engaged with Gabrielli's bold vision. After deliberations, a select committee was formed, and Gabrielli proposed an even larger £1 million loan to be raised in London. The terms included a 6% interest rate, secured by town rates, with the colonial government contributing £25,000 annually for 40 years to a sinking fund. The Legislative Council passed the enabling legislation in April 1854. Gabrielli secured interim funding from the Bank of Australasia and successfully placed debentures on the London Stock Exchange. With the funds, Melbourne began paving its roads, a major public works initiative, and St Kilda received a major share of it too. During this time, pressure was building on Melbourne Council to separate St Kilda into a separate municipality. When the loan was repaid, and the influence of central ratepayers waned, the City of Melbourne agreed to release St Kilda to become a separate council. Although St Kilda was only incorporated as a municipal district on the 24th of April, 1855, progress came swiftly. Within just a few years, 24 miles of roads had been built, 18 of them macadamized, and 6 curbed in hardwood, later replaced with bluestone pitches. On the 11th of March, 1857, St Kilda held its first municipal meeting, electing Benjamin Cowderoy as its inaugural chairman. The first council meeting was held in 1857 beside the Junction Hotel. By 1859, St Kilda had its own town hall, the second suburban town hall in Melbourne, located at the corner of Grey and Robe Streets. That same year, the Melbourne Gas Company installed 28 gas lamps, including some in private homes. By 1861, the council maintained 44 street lamps, 31 gas and 13 oil. Cowderoy designed the council's crest and selected its motto. Under his leadership, a civic transformation began. By 1862, St Kilda's population had grown to 6,400, with 1,400 ratepayers. In March 1856, the Melbourne and Hobsons Bay Railway Company was authorised to build a branch line to St Kilda. The line ran parallel to today's Ferrers Street and Canterbury Road. By 1860, it was moving over 1 million passengers and 170,000 tonnes of goods annually, a major lifeline for the growing suburb. Meanwhile, Brighton landowners formed a rival syndicate in 1857, the St Kilda and Brighton Railway Company. Their 5-mile loop connected St Kilda and Windsor, then curved south to Brighton. Until the railway opened in May 1857, St Kilda had been little more than a scattered village, cut off by rough bush tracks. The arrival of the train marked the beginning of its golden era, one driven by access, ambition, and the lure of the sea. Trains ran hourly from Melbourne, but despite carrying nearly 200,000 passengers a year by 1861, the expensive loop proved unviable. It was closed in 1862, the company went into liquidation, and the line was absorbed by the Melbourne and Suburban Company. St Kilda also laid claim to a unique chapter in Australia's seaside culture. In 1853, Mrs. Mary Ford began offering rooms by the hour at her house on the Esplanade for swimmers to change, one of the earliest signs of organised beach bathing. A year later, she sold the property to Captain William Kenny, a seafarer from Essex who had arrived in Melbourne commanding a ship full of gold rush immigrants. Captain Kenny soon made waves of his own. He purchased a condemned 200-ton brig, Nancy, scuttled it near the foreshore, and enclosed a section of shallow water to create Melbourne's first structured sea baths. At first, the baths made little profit. But in 1857, Kenny added rows of changing cubicles, segregated for men and women, and sea bathing took off in popularity, especially after the arrival of the railway. Men paid sixpence per session, including a towel, or could purchase a season pass. Women paid a shilling, which included the hire of a voluminous bathing costume. Kenny's baths became a Melbourne institution, and he, a beloved local figure. Until his death in 1907 at the age of 80, Captain Kenny was known to regale his dwindling patrons with tales of the wool kings and squatters who had once made his bathing ship their cleansing mecca, a refreshing dip after long journeys from the hot, dusty inland plains. In its early days, St Kilda had no piped water supply. Residents depended entirely on rainwater, which they collected and stored in tanks. Before the construction of the Yangyin Reservoir, water was drawn from the Yarra River above the falls, carted into town, and sold by water carriers, who often exploited demand to charge high prices. As Melbourne grew, an elevated cast iron tank was installed on Eastern Hill. It was filled by steam pump from the Yarra's north bank and provided limited reticulated water to the city. To meet growing needs south of the river, the South Yarra Water Works Company was established in 1855. It set up a steam pump on Forest Hill to draw Yarra water into a tank at the corner of Chapel Street and Gardners Creek Road, supplying nearby areas. The scheme was later extended with another large tank and 5 standpipes near St Kilda Junction. It wasn't uncommon to see 20 water carts queued at a time, waiting to be filled. This system remained in place until water from the Yangyin Reservoir, Melbourne's first major water supply, finally reached St Kilda, ending the era of water carts and rooftop tanks. The St Kilda Botanical Gardens, originally known as Blessington Street Gardens, were formally established in 1859 with the erection of a boundary fence. Officially gazetted on the 28th of September that year, the gardens opened to the public in 1861. The council had allocated 16 acres for this green sanctuary, a symbol of the suburb's growing civic pride. By the 1860s, St Kilda had become Melbourne's most prestigious address. Judges, politicians, and wealthy magnates built grand homes in the area. Yet it was never entirely exclusive. The poorer classes lived in small cottages on the Balaclava Flat, servants resided in modest quarters on larger estates, and Chinese fishermen camped in tents along West Beach. They survived on simple fare bread, potatoes, and produce from the local market. Transport within St Kilda also continued to evolve. In 1872, Gunns railway cars began operating between the railway station and the Village Bell Hotel, also serving the Baths and the Esplanade. George Gunn, with his stables in Commercial Road, Prahran, was authorised to operate within railway precincts. His popular Red Line of cabs, with the motto, "Red light by night, red flag by day, 3 pence each way," became a familiar sight. Tragically, in 1877, a fire at his stables killed many of his horses, but Gunn's legacy in local transport lived on. St Kilda's first tram service along the Esplanade was a humble horse-drawn tram, operated by the Melbourne Tramway and Omnibus Company. By 1890, with the Melbourne Tramways Trust in place, the St Kilda Council successfully negotiated an upgrade, replacing the aging horse tram with a state-of-the-art cable tramway, marking a leap in public transport. The Council's 1891 annual report proudly declared the new Esplanade cable tramway as perhaps the most satisfactory and complete in the world, praised by the travelling public across Melbourne. Its construction, however, required more than just new tracks. To accommodate the cable system, the upper roadway of the Esplanade had to be widened. The council allocated £5,000 from loan funds to the project. An embankment wall was built, and the gap between the wall and the original road was filled with thousands of loads of spoil, mostly sand, raising the level by an average of 19 feet. The upgraded Esplanade varied in width from 100 to 126 feet, transforming both transport and the public landscape of St Kilda. In 1863, a kind old woman known simply as Granny began selling fruit and sweets on the St Kilda Esplanade. Beloved by generations of children, she became a local institution, her stall, a must-visit after a swim. When a fierce storm in 1864 destroyed her setup, the community rallied, raising funds to build her a little shop by the foreshore. Granny worked there until age and frailty caught up with her. She spent her final days in the Melbourne Benevolent Asylum, where she was well cared for. When she died around 1872, the council honoured her memory by removing the stall, saying simply, "It was Granny's. Now she's gone, so it must go too." On the 23rd of November, 1867, Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, became the first British royal to set foot in Victoria, landing at St Kilda from HM frigate Galatea. In honour of his visit, Alfred Square was named. In the 1880s, St Kilda was widely seen as genteel and well-bred, so much so that when police discovered prostitutes on Ackland Street in 1886, they were ordered to leave at once. Their kind, it was said, had no place in such a refined suburb. In the early 1890s, after the land boom collapsed, St Kilda lost some of its elite residents to rising suburbs like Toorak and South Yarra. Cable trams brought day trippers and larrikins, and grand mansions were converted into boarding houses. Yet St Kilda adapted, still home to wealth, and later, the fashionable new flats of the post-war era. By 1871, around 50 Jewish families had made St Kilda their home. That year, they formed the St Kilda Hebrew Congregation, a community known for its Anglo-Jewish respectability and aristocratic formality, echoing the grandeur of the empire's wealthiest congregations. To the northwest of St Kilda, a swampy stretch of land long resisted development. But by the 1870s, it was drained and transformed into Albert Park Lake. By 1890, a military road, Beaconsfield Parade, traced the foreshore, unlocking new land for urban growth. Initially, the council met in a room beside the Junction Hotel. In 1860, the first official town hall opened within a building attached to the courthouse. Bryce Bunny was elected the first mayor. But the suburb's rising affluence called for grandeur. After much debate over location and cost, St Kilda's new boom-style town hall, designed by prominent architect William Pitt, opened on the 23rd of June, 1890, rising from a former swamp at Brighton Road and Carlisle Street. 6 months later, on the 2nd of December, 1890, Governor Lord Hopetoun formally proclaimed St Kilda a city, a title it had long earned through ambition, resilience, and flair. From its earliest days, St Kilda's coastline has continually evolved. The St Kilda Pier and Jetty Company formed in 1853, though the original jetty, aligned with Fitzroy Street, was destroyed in a storm. A pier, built in 1859 and extended in 1883, reached its full 2,300-foot length by 1889. An L-shaped extension allowed paddle steamers like the Ozone, Hygeia, and Wirona to dock until 1949. In 1901, the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and York, later King George V and Queen Mary, landed here to a grand reception for the opening of Australia's first federal parliament. In October 1903, Spanish-born Francis Pera submitted a proposal to the St Kilda Council to build a kiosk at the L-shaped junction of the pier. His vision combined a refreshment kiosk with an observatory, a place to relax, enjoy the sea air, and take in the views. Completed in 1904, the structure was named the Austral Refreshment Rooms, though it became affectionately known as Pera's Pavilion. Designed in a decorative Edwardian style with commanding arches, it stood apart from traditional English pavilions, unique to Victoria and rare in Australia. The pavilion marked a shift in the pier's identity, from working jetty to leisure destination. Pera and his wife Mary operated and lived in the kiosk under a 30-year government lease. Its open balcony became a favourite spot in summer. Downstairs, patrons enjoyed coffee and ice cream. Upstairs, courting couples found quiet corners with sea breezes. Ever the public servant, Pera also flew weather flags each morning, based on forecasts from the Commonwealth meteorologist H.A. Hunt. Like much of Melbourne, the pavilion struggled during the Great Depression. Francis Pera passed away in 1925. His successor, Major Payne, considered turning it into a cabaret, but never followed through. The next manager, Noble Kirby, added a dance floor, beginning a new chapter. From 1939 to 1989, the Kirby family managed the kiosk across 2 generations. Noble and his wife Ivy were followed by their son Colin and daughter-in-law Judy. During their tenure, the second floor was expanded into a family residence, and several additions were made. In World War II, the venue buzzed with US servicemen. By the 1950s, the Kirbys had even introduced performing seal shows at dusk on warm afternoons. Tragically, on the 11th of September, 2003, the kiosk was destroyed by fire. But in 2006, it was faithfully reconstructed using the original 1904 architectural drawings. In December 2024, the redeveloped St Kilda Pier, including the beloved kiosk, reopened to the public, once again standing as a symbol of St Kilda's enduring charm and layered history. Today, the western side of St Kilda Pier remains alive with energy, a designated wind sports zone where paddleboarders, windsurfers, and kiteboarders fill the bay. Marked by yellow buoys and bordered by the breakwater, the area permits recreational boating under strict conditions, including a speed limit of 5 knots. On the eastern side, the water is reserved exclusively for swimmers. At the heart of the foreshore lies St Kilda Harbour, home to the Royal Melbourne Yacht Squadron, one of Victoria's oldest yacht clubs, founded in 1876 as the St Kilda Sailing Club. What began with just 20 members is now a vibrant hub for recreational boating. To the south sits the St Kilda Marina, continuing the area's nautical tradition. A little further along the beach stands the St Kilda Sea Baths, a modern complex offering pools, a spa, dining, and entertainment. It carries the legacy of a long line of sea bath structures that once graced this shoreline. The most iconic was the Spanish Moorish-styled version built in 1931, demolished in the 1990s. The current structure was rebuilt to reflect elements of the original design. Beyond the leisure and lifestyle lies one of St Kilda's most unexpected treasures. A colony of around 1,200 little penguins, nesting in the rocks of the St Kilda breakwater. Every evening at dusk, they return from the sea to their burrows, a year-round spectacle. Day visitors, with a bit of patience, might even spot them hiding during daylight hours. Some can be coaxed into view by local anglers offering fish, a blink and you'll miss it moment as the penguins dash out and disappear again. Each summer, for 2 weeks, the penguins undergo their annual molt, a complete replacement of their feathers. During this time, they remain hidden, relying on stored fat as they can't hunt. It's a vulnerable phase, but a natural and essential one. 2 timber stairways lead visitors to the wooden walkway along the breakwater, offering up-close views of this remarkable urban colony. Carlo Catani, a civil engineer trained in Florence, Italy, made an unlikely journey to Australia. Recruited by a New Zealand immigration agency while in Germany, he travelled to Wellington as a labourer with a friend. In 1876, the pair crossed to Australia, describing themselves as miners. Katani soon joined the Department of Lands and Survey as a draftsman and rose through the ranks. His early work, including the draining of the Kuwirup swamp and the creation of Alexandra Gardens in Melbourne, established his reputation. In 1906, recognising St Kilda's importance as Victoria's premier seaside resort, the St Kilda Foreshore Committee was created. This committee, made up of local council and state government representatives, was tasked with managing 2 hectares of land between Fraser and Dickens Streets, reserved for public recreation and amusement. Carlo Catani, now chief engineer, led the redevelopment. He reimagined the foreshore in the style of a Mediterranean resort, with a split-level esplanade, landscaped gardens, dance halls, theatres, and amusements. His work extended up to Point Ormond. To honour his legacy, and in memory of his long-held wish to see a clock tower gracing the beach, the St Kilda Council commissioned a permanent tribute. In August 1932, the Catani Memorial Clock Tower was unveiled, a timeless symbol of the man whose vision helped define the St Kilda we know today. The beautified precinct, including gardens at the beach end, was named in his honour, Catani Gardens. Several other foreshore landmarks, including the gardens, arch, and clock tower, still bear his name. The gardens today remain a popular retreat and house several historic monuments, standing as a tribute to Catani's lasting vision. Luna Park opened in December 1912 with great fanfare, launched by the Federal Minister for External Affairs in the presence of Melbourne's Lord Mayor and the Mayor of St Kilda. Inspired by Coney Island in New York, it was designed by Ptolemaic Harriet Eslick and Vernon Corbet. The First World War brought operational setbacks, and the park closed for several years. It reopened in October 1923 after a complete reconstruction, unveiling new attractions, the most celebrated being the Carousel, built by the Philadelphia Toboggan Company. It was Carousel number 30 out of only 80 the company produced between 1903 and 1931, making it a prized relic of amusement history. During the Second World War, Luna Park thrived, drawing in American troops stationed in Melbourne. Today, it stands as one of the few continuously operating amusement parks for over a century. Its iconic features, the Moonface entrance, the scenic railway, the Dodgem building, and the beloved Carousel, still capture the magic of its early days. At the same time, the Phillips brothers were expanding St Kilda's entertainment scene. In 1913, they built the Palais de Danse, despite protests from church leaders and councillors who feared the moral dangers of the tango. In 1915, the dance hall was converted into a picture theatre. A new cinema opened on the site in 1920, and the dance hall was relocated next door. After the original theatre burned down in 1926, it was replaced by a grand new Palais Theatre, seating over 3,000 people, and becoming a cultural landmark in its own right. In December 1914, a bronze statue of Captain James Cook was unveiled at West Beach, a donation from Andrew Stenhouse, a local member of the St Kilda Shore Committee. In recent years, however, the statue became a flashpoint for protest. It was graffitied in 2018 with the words "No Pride," splashed with red paint in 2022, and in 2024, cut down at the ankles and removed from its plinth. Back in the 1980s, St Kilda had earned a reputation as one of Melbourne's most troubled suburbs, associated with crime, drugs, and social marginalisation. Fitzroy Street featured in media headlines like Devil's Playground and Streets of Hell, and documentaries exposed its darker corners. Artist Albert Tucker once described it as a dynamic place where good and evil worked alongside. In response to its tarnished image, the St Kilda Festival was launched in 1980 to celebrate the area's vibrant community and creative spirit. Originally a local showcase, the festival has grown into a major cultural event with music at its heart. Since then, St Kilda has undergone a dramatic transformation, evolving from gritty to glamorous. Today, it's one of Melbourne's most desirable beachside suburbs, reflecting Australia's enduring love of coastal life, community, and reinvention. From its swampy beginnings and seaside storms to dance halls, grand mansions, and carnival lights, St Kilda has never stood still. It has been a retreat for the wealthy, a refuge for the struggling, and a playground for all. Along its shoreline, every era has left its mark, in architecture, in memories, and in spirit. Today, St Kilda is more than just a suburb, it's a living chronicle of Melbourne's ever-changing heartbeat. A place where history, resilience, and the rhythm of the waves continue to shape the story of a city by the sea.